Okay, Biology B students, this is lesson 4.2, evolution. Evolution simply is, or the learning targets for the week is to analyze and explain the experiments of the historical scientific perspectives, fossil record, modern ideas of the origin and diversity of life, and all the different individuals that played a role in this, and we'll get right into it. So here we go. Evolution is a change in characteristics of living things over time. As described by Darwin, evolution occurs by a process called natural selection. Okay, so that's kind of what we'll be going through here. What was Darwin's theories, and what was the process called, and how does it work? So, from a historical perspective, prior to the studies of Darwin, most widespread belief was that all known species were created at the same time and remained unchanged throughout history. Some scientists at the time believed that features in an individual acquired during a lifetime could be passed on to its offspring, and the species could gradually fit to an environment better. So, for example, we had the use it or lose it theory, which basically says the more you use something, the more it would develop. So, for example, a blacksmith would have be a pretty physical person from pounding metal all day long, pretty strong, and then their offspring tended to be that way. Well, the truth was the offspring were doing the same thing that the parents were doing at the time, the father was doing, and he became muscular from pounding metal all day long. So anyway, who influenced Darwin? Many did. Many of the scientists of the same period. You can click here and look at all the different people that played a role in it. But Charles Bonnet was one of them. Okay, Charles Bonnet is a Swiss naturalist and philosopher, 1700s. Each female organism contains within its germ cells an infinite series of preformed individuals who cannot be changed. So the person was already, the baby was inside of a preformed egg or something like that, and is already developed into a person. Earth periodically suffers universal catastrophes, destroying most life, and that the survivors move up a notch on the evolutionary scale. First, to use the term evolution in a biological context, that was Bonnet. Then we had Linnaeus. We heard about him earlier with classification, but he began to classify animals and plants hierarchically in the 18th century. Cats and lions belonged to a particular family, the felines, grouped with dogs in the order carnivores, and they also were grouped in the class Mammalia. Linnaeus believed that a logical creator had created an ordered world which could be understood. Darwin reinterpreted as evidence of different degrees of shared ancestry. Lamarck was another individual who was influential in Darwin's theories. He said change through use and disuse. Organisms must change due to changing environments. Giraffe stretched its neck for leaves. Over time, the neck increased in length, and their offspring inherited this longer neck, and they can grab food higher and higher up in the tree. And then we had organs that didn't, organs stopped using would shrink. So, for example, like our appendix. Darwin argued that only biologically inherited characteristics were advantageous in surviving and reproducing. The offspring would also inherit and pass on those advantages. Over generations, the aggregation of these inherited advantages would lead to a new species. Thomas Malthus, he was an economist, and he said, in nature, plants and animals produce far more offspring than actually can survive. Man, too, is capable of overproducing if left unchecked. Unless family size was regulated, man's misery of famine would become globally epidemic and eventually consume man. In other words, if we look here, here's the carrying capacity of the planet, right? If the population goes too high, we're not going to have enough food. As long as we stay at or below this line, then we would have enough food for humans to exist on the planet. So Darwin would use this information as a way to explain natural selection. The surviving offspring had something genetically that allowed them to survive and thus would pass this on to their offspring, so some sort of an advantage. Charles Lyell in the 1800s, in his 3-volume Principles of Geology, Lyell documented the fact that the Earth must be very old. You need a lot of time for evolution to take place. So the older it was, the more evolution that could potentially happen, and the more evidence that Darwin would need for his theory. Earth has been subject to the same sort of natural processes in the past that operate today in shaping the land. These forces include erosion, earthquakes, glacial movement, volcanoes, and even the decomposition of plants and animals. Darwin needed time for evolution to happen, and current thoughts were that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. Alfred Wenger, right, the German climatologist and geophysicist, 1915, published an expanded version of his 1912 Origin of the Continents and Oceans, suggests continental drift and plate tectonics, which means that the continents were once together and they split apart, which means you would have fossil evidence when they were together of the same stuff, and then when they split. And something like in Africa and South America, if they were together, they would have the same fossil record. Suggested a supercontinent called Pangaea had existed, broke up starting 200 million years ago, drifted to present conditions and positions, cited the fit of South America and Africa, ancient climate similarities, fossil evidence, such as the fern Glossopteris, Andomesosaurus, and the similarity of rock structures. They move, I tell you, they move, right? And so you can see they split apart, but right here, things that were living here and things that were living here would be separated by the Atlantic Ocean. But if you look at the fossil evidence here and the fossil evidence here, it will be the same. Darwin used Lyell's Age of the Earth to help explain the enormous amounts of time to see change in a population. The Wegener information helped solidify Darwin's notion that Earth was really old. So, Darwin, you can see his vessel there, the HMS Beagle, very famous. It was commissioned by the Royal Navy. Evolution means change over time. Scientific theory is not just a belief, it's well-supported, tested explanation. In 1831, Darwin set sail on a 5-year journey. Imagine being on that vessel for 5 years going around the planet. In 1844, he wound up writing his theory of the origin of the species. Charles Darwin went on an around-the-world trip on the HMS Beagle and traveled to the Galapagos Islands off of South America. He particularly liked and observed the finches, which is a little bird. He also observed the tortoises on different islands. He observed each different group had its own little niche, its own little role, its own little experience on those islands as they were separated by an ocean. So they were slightly different. There you can see his voyage. Studied 13 different species, saw how they adapted to their environment. All right, so the Galapagos Islands are right here. So here are the birds. Depending on the island, their beaks were slightly different. And they were different because of the food source. So if you look at this beak right here, it probably had very big nuts that it had to crack. So it needed a massive beak. Something like this would be really, really tiny seeds. So you need a very small beak to pick those up. This would be take a lot of energy to pick up little seeds, kind of overkill and you waste energy. The various Galapagos Islands had their own little microclimates, so slightly different conditions, more water, less water, more heat, less heat. This led to a variety of different plants on each island specific to that island. The seeds were different, small seeds versus large seeds. Darwin noticed how the beaks changed. So these birds were different on each island. Same thing with the tortoises. If you look at the necks here, this has the shell, it has an arch. This shell is straight. His neck cannot reach as high as this one because of the arch. So this one probably eats stuff that's above, in a bush that's higher up off the ground, whereas this one's eating stuff closer to the ground. So This tortoise probably living on an area where there's a lot of grassland, and this one where there's a lot of shrubs and leafy, woody plants that have leaves above. So the location of vegetation island from change to change. On some islands, vegetation was on the ground, others grew off the ground. Tortoise shells changed in order to adapt and be able to live in an area where the food sources were different. When he returned home, Darwin returned home, he read other people's materials about geological changes. He studied selective breeding of domestic animals and crops. You can take a look at the video and see some more information here. He found that any domesticated plant or animal bred to attenuate desirable characteristics is the result of artificial selection, not natural. Natural happens on its own. But if we want to breed a hairy dog with a really small dog to get a small hairy dog, that's artificial selection. Many veggies we eat today came from the wild mustard plant through artificial selection. The corn we eat today is about 300 different varieties of the original corn that the Pilgrims had. So his book was called The Origin of the Species, came out in 1859, very quick success. It became from the clear and understandable argument that natural selection, selective breeding of animals was in wide use at the time. There was a massive array of biological fossil evidence to support his argument. Selective breeding of organisms produce certain desired traits in their offspring. Now, again, with a very religious type of climate, this was not something that he wanted to publish lightly. So he wanted to make sure he had all the information that he potentially can have to help support his theories. Darwin's 5 theories were evolution. Species come and go through time. While they exist, they change. Common descent. Organisms are descended from one or several common ancestors and have changed from the original stock or the original individuals. Species multiply. The diversification of life, the variance of life, involves populations of one species diverging until they become 2 separate species. This has probably occurred billions of times. Remember, a species is something that can reproduce with its own kind and produce offspring that can also reproduce. Gradualism, evolutionary change, occurs through incremental small changes within populations. New species are not created suddenly. Finally, natural selection. Evolution change occurs through a variation between individuals. Some variants give the individual an extra survival probability. So, after the publication of The Origin of Species, biological evolution was supported by the genetics experiments of Gregor Mendel, by the identification of genes. Genes are sorted in reproduction. Discovery that genetic code found in DNA is the same for almost all organisms. Darwin came to his conclusions prior to Mendel's work. And that concludes 4.2.